I would like to welcome everybody to our event almost this afternoon here at noon on Duke University campus. An opportunity to talk about climate justice, the roots, experiences, and future of climate justice. A very important topic for the time and an opportunity for us to center justice issues here at Duke University. As you may or may not know, Duke University just yesterday made a very strong pronouncement about the importance of climate change and how we want to infuse climate change through every aspect of our mission at the university, whether that's research, education, community outreach, engagement, external impact, and our operations and facilities management. So as part of that commitment, we have said we would make investments in key substantive areas: energy transformation, climate and data, community and climate resilience, as well as environmental and climate justice. So this panel today is an opportunity for us to continue to probe the important aspects of justice issues as they relate to the climate. I think today's a really good reminder as we're experiencing the hurricane outside right now, and halfway around the world. In the Philippines, Super Typhoon Neru is also sort of being, the impacts are being felt halfway around the world. So there are a lot of issues for us to be contemplating at this moment in time when we think about the impacts of climate all around us. So our hope is basically that this discussion and this part of will develop into probably a stronger series of conversations around climate justice, which of course are a little bit separate from environmental justice and deserve their own time in the sun and give us an opportunity to discuss these important topics. So as we think about that, we have an incredibly esteemed panel that has gathered with us here this morning, and I'm very pleased and honored to be able to introduce them. The first person I get to introduce this morning is William Barber III. He works as an environmental and climate justice scholar and advocate, a decade of social justice organizing experience under his belt and deep academic training, both in the social sciences and the law. He is a native of Eastern North Carolina. He developed an interest and a commitment to social justice and environmental stewardship at an early age, given where he is from in the state. I think we're incredibly fortunate to have you with us this morning, William, and we look forward to your comments. He received a BS in environmental physics from North Carolina Central University. He earned his JD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Law. He is very focused on environmental law and policy. He currently works as the Director of Climate and Environmental Justice at the Climate Reality Project and is the Chief Consultant of Environmental Justice and Equity for the Coalition for Green Capital, a group that specializes in driving clean investments to disadvantaged communities utilizing the green bank method. Of course, it's just become more important given the passage of our recent climate legislation. He is also the founder and the CEO of the World Beacon Initiative, a business working to increase BIPOC and representation in energy and regenerative food sectors through a variety of deployed projects. So he is a very busy man, and we are lucky to have you with us today. So thank you for joining us. Next, I have down the line Jennifer Hadden. Jennifer is currently an associate professor in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. She conducts research in international relations, environmental politics, network analysis, and non-state actors and social movements. She received her PhD from Cornell University's Department of Government and has a BA with highest honors in government from Smith College. At the University of Maryland, she is faculty affiliate with the Center of International Development and Conflict Management and the Center for Global Sustainability. She held an International Affairs Fellowship with the Council on Foreign Relations from 2015 to 2016, supporting work on the Paris Climate Conference in the Office of the Special Envoy for Climate Change at the U.S. Department of State. Dr. Hadden's book, Networks in Contention, The Divisive Politics of Global Climate Change, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. It received 4 book awards from the American Political Science Association and the International Political Science Association. Dr. Hadden, we're so happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us as well. And then joining us from across the ocean, we're especially lucky to have, is Yumna Kamel. Yumna is the executive director and co-founder of Refuge. It was established to address the gap in legal protections for climate migrants globally. Her work is centered upon legal advocacy and in particular empowering affected communities by amplifying their narratives, researching their corresponding legal rights, and ensuring that they are recognized. Most certainly, she is involved in protecting the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. Yumna has a background in asylum and immigration law and is the legal education officer of the London-based NGO Right to Remain, where she maintains the Right to Remain toolkit, which you can access online, and delivers workshops about the legal system to asylum and migrant groups across the United Kingdom. She completed her LLB at Queen Mary University of London and was called to the bar in London, Wales in 2020. She also holds an LLM from the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School, where she graduated with a public interest fellowship for commitment to social justice. So I think you can all agree that our panel is amazing and esteemed, and we're going to learn a lot from them. Finally, our moderator today is Gabriela Nagle Alverio. Gabriela is a joint JD PhD student in the University Program on Environmental Policy that is held between the Nicholas School of the Environment and the Stanford School of Public Policy. Her concentration is on political science. Her research interests include the impacts of climate change on human rights and policy solutions. Her dissertation research is focused on climate-induced migration within and from Central America. And if you were fortunate to join us last night at our events, you would have seen a presentation that she was part of there, which was absolutely wonderful. She has a BA in International Relations and an MA in Environmental Communications from Stanford University. So without any further ado, I'm going to let everybody get to it because I am really excited about it. So thank you everybody for showing up on this very rainy day that reminds us why it's so important that we do this work. Please welcome our panel.
Thank you so much. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that intro, Dean Steelman, and for your commitment to climate justice overall. I'm really excited to be here with you all. Hopefully you all can hear, right? Good. And thank you all for coming in person and facing the storm. And thanks to those joining us online as well. I'm really excited to be here talking about climate justice, especially the day after the launch of the climate commitment. Personally, because it's something I study and care about, but one of the things I found recently in doing some research on the overlap between climate and social justice is that we see it happening out in the world, but in academia, it's often lacking. These connections, the interdisciplinary connections and collaboration is just often not there. And so I'm really excited to have this panel kind of start that dialogue for us as we launch into this climate commitment to hopefully continue that moving forward. And with that, I mean, each of your backgrounds really highlights the variety of perspectives that you bring to this topic. So I would love to start just by hearing how you came to be passionate about climate justice. And I'll pass it to you and just kind of go down the line that way. And it's on, so you should be good. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me. I wanted to start by thanking Duke for welcoming me so graciously to your campus. I'm so happy to be here today and to be part of this conversation. And thank you, Gabriela. Mm-hmm. So I started working in the climate justice field relatively recently, and I came to it via the immigration route. And that's because at the start of the pandemic, a dear friend of mine and I were at the University of Pennsylvania, and she came to law school as a result of her interest in environmental law, and I came via the immigration route, and we realized that there was close to nothing to protect people fleeing the impacts of climate-induced disasters. No legal definition, either internationally, regionally, or even locally anywhere in the world. And yet it was sort of being treated as something that is going to happen in the future. But it's happening now, and it's only set to get worse. And in fact, more people flee climate disasters than war or persecution. So when faced with those statistics and this legal vacuum, we were set into motion, and we launched Refuge to study that gap and to try to fill it, but crucially through a community-focused lens. So consulting with affected communities, understanding what their needs are, and then trying to match those needs with sort of niche legal solutions and advocating for those rights, as opposed to imposing an overarching legal definition upon them and assuming that we know what's best. So we like to describe ourselves as a legal lifeline for climate migrants. And we try to raise awareness of the issue because despite the increasing popularity of climate justice and sort of popular culture, migration is oddly often left out of that discourse. So we try to increase discourse and then speak to the legal community to point them in the direction of protection. So that's how I came into this. Thank you
so much.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here today, and thank you everyone for this invitation. Also, congratulations to you on this climate commitment initiative. That's really exciting. And I really agree with Gabriela that it's important that we have these conversations about justice in the academic space, because I think sometimes we don't focus enough on that. So I'm really supportive of everything you just said on that topic. For myself, I think I followed a somewhat traditional route to first becoming interested in climate change, and that I was interested in environmental science, and I really thought about this as being kind of a scientific problem. I had a lot of background in hiking in the outdoors and the Sierra Club and that sort of thing, and I really thought about the climate change problem as being an environmental problem that was about protecting polar bears and all of this, and that was really my understanding of it for quite a long time, and that led me to be quite passionate about it because that framing really resonated with me. But one of the things that shifted for me, and it was kind of a light bulb moment, was that I had the opportunity, first professionally working for a climate NGO, and then later as an academic, to attend UN climate conferences and to meet with people who were already being strongly impacted by climate change. So fishing people in Southeast Asia and women in Africa and farmers in Mexico who were coming to this process to share their stories. And it just really highlighted for me how climate change is so much broader than an environmental problem. And you know, at the same time, this was in the mid-2000s, there were things going on domestically that really brought this to the fore, like Hurricane Katrina, I think, which was a really important moment in the way that I understood climate change. And so it was sort of the weaving together of those two threads. And when I was working in the UN climate process, it was also around the time that the climate justice movement was starting to take off in the international setting. And so watching that arise and watching how the voices of those who are trying to bring this perspective to the international debate were either ignored or really marginalized or sort of tokenized in that process was really important to me. It led me to want to do academic work on this topic and to kind of try to document that movement and highlight those voices. So that's really how I became interested in this.
Thank you both for those stories. It's really inspiring to always join a panel like this with the same see how we get to this work. My background, I really think in the bucket of trees individually, based on the data and then the familiar legacy. So individually, I am a native of Eastern North Carolina. I grew up in an area, Goldsboro, in an area that is close to what many may see as the front lines of the climate crisis in our state and our nation. But that was not my first introduction to that landscape. I also grew up witnessing the deep self-determination, the deep innovation, the deep commitments between people and land in that area. So, you know, my first introduction to this region was not one of impact or, you know, being the front lines of a crisis, but was one of deep community. And in doing that, I developed a great personal affinity for this personal connection between land, community, and what that looked like. As I deepened my career and my training, I started to particularly focus on environmental crisis, and I started to connect the dots between how this emerging environmental crisis was threatening the very community that I came from, that I really cared about. And I began to see this as a multiplier on all of the social inequities, you know, that community so often face. I scratched a little more and started to realize that the problem was much deeper then localized legacy pollution, environmental injustice. But it was a global problem when we talked about the coming climate crisis. I also looked at the data, I mentioned the data of the third decade, in deepening that work, and especially in law school, that led up my academic career. Did a mapping exercise where I looked at the concentrations of persistent poverty communities across the nation, then overlay that with the concentration of communities of color, and then had access to data that overlaid that with the areas that were experiencing the greatest frequency of billion-dollar climate-induced extreme weather disasters. And for me, that just was a powerful illustration of what all of us in this room know subconsciously, but just seeing it visually as an entire exercise, is that when we talk about the low-hanging fruit of climate impact here in the United States, the people who are being hit right now by this crisis are largely poor, largely communities of color, largely in the southeastern United States. Data also tells us that out of the top 100 counties expected to be the most impacted by climate change, by 2030, 99 are in the southeast. So as a native of Eastern North Carolina, as a son of the South, that put a particular urgency for me to commit myself to understanding how our communities and how our regional leadership really need to be at the helm of solutions to the climate crisis. And then finally, I mentioned the familial legacy. So there's a deep connection between that I honor between my personal activism today and the past activism of my ancestors. So of course, my father, Bishop William Barber II of the Poor People's Campaign, is very much involved in social activism and social equity. But one of his first engagements was actually challenging the dumping of toxic waste behind communities of color, clandestine dumping of toxic waste in Virginia. Before him, my grandfather was actually connected to William J. Barber Sr., was connected to the marches, the original marches of Warren County. The 1982 protest that launched the National Environmental Justice Movement. And then even before him, my great-grandfather, Benjamin Luther Hughes, was a miner who was involved in the Battle of Manhattan. And if anyone knows that history, that was one of America's largest social uprising, where an interracial group of coal miners actually came to challenge abuse by the coal industry. So all highlighting this tension that has always existed between worker strikes and our energy source as a nation. So that history runs very deep in my veins. It's something I think about today, and it's a part of what fuels my work.
Thank you so much. I'll leave the mic with you there and we'll kind of go this way, but I'm just struck by hearing all of you, though we come from so many, such different backgrounds, the link between seeing injustice, feeling it, and then also turning to the data and seeing it there and having that kind of reinforce what we already know to be true. So thank you all for sharing. We've thrown around the word climate justice already here, but we haven't really talked about what it means. And often we are discussing it and I think not really talking about the same thing. So I'd love to start with how you define climate justice.
Absolutely. So, I really appreciate you all highlighting at the beginning of this conversation the distinctions between environmental justice, between climate justice, and as an energy justice advocate, I would also throw in the term energy justice. These concepts often do get conflicted, but they are separate and distinct. They build upon one another. Actually, the three, this triumvirate from the nexus when we think about the conversation around just transition, but they are separate and distinct. So when we look at climate justice, it is actually defined as the remediation of the impacts of climate change on poor people and people of color, those who are impacted first and worst, and compensation for harm suffered by such communities due to climate change. Climate justice also makes us aware that the climate crisis is yes a matter of being an environmental issue. It is yes an issue of policy, but it is also a social issue. It is also a racial issue. It is also an issue of economic justice. This is also a gender issue. It is also an issue of immigration, because the climate crisis serves as a multiplier on deep-seated social inequities. I often say social inequities that unfortunately we have perfected as a society because they have been the result of intentional bad policy decisions. climate justice really, makes us look at the climate crisis through the lens of acknowledging the disproportionate impacts for people that we are all hit by it, but not all impacted the same way. It makes us recognize the legacy of a energy sector that has been heavily informed by environmental racism and it depends on the fossil fuel economy, what that means for us as a nation, but also in the global context. And it also makes us acknowledge that when we are thinking about solutions, we have to amplify the voices of those communities on the front lines.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree with all of that, and I just build on it in a way, emphasizing as well that I think there's a procedural dimension to climate justice as well, that is also a big component of the environmental justice movement, where we want to think about a process of decision-making that allows for self-determination of communities and informed consent as communities are exposed to various kinds of mitigation and adaptation measures, right? And that sometimes the danger in the climate space is that the issue is so urgent that we want to move quickly without acknowledging those important procedural considerations. So I would add that, I think, to my understanding of climate justice.
Completely agree with my fellow panelists. I would just add for any sort of newbies to the field, the difference between climate events and environmental events. So, because I was a rookie not too long ago when I had to have this distinction made for me. So climate events are natural disasters essentially. So hurricanes, for an example. Environmental events are slightly more social, if you will. So the dumping of toxic waste, the redlining of Black communities to areas that are nearer to toxic dump sites or the like. So it has this more sort of human element. Obviously the climate crisis is human driven, but it's almost more indirect. It's harder to process in our minds. So climate justice relates to the impacts of climate induced disasters, and environmental justice relates to all of the above. And the way the two intersect is that environmental policy, which is often racist and unjust, sets this horrific foundation so that the impacts of climate-induced events then impact those communities that are touched by environmental policy worse. So the intersection is this exacerbation of travesty. So that's how I differentiate between the two.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we kind of started to touch on this with your comments and kind of ending here, but just to hammer it home, what are the specific differences between climate and environmental justice for people who are trying to understand that? And as of now, is climate justice separate from environmental justice in the movement specifically? And how do we see that? And whoever wants to start can start. I don't know if you want to start. You kind of just gave us that great overview. Yeah.
Yes, I'll start with just some real simple definitions. The distinctions are clear. And what's beautiful about defining these terms in this moment is that there is an entire history of social movement, of activism, of academia. That means we don't have to start from scratch. I think that's important to hold as these terms are now coming to light and gaining momentum, is these are not squishy abstract concepts where there has not been study or, a foundation behind. Environmental justice, of course, is defined by the EPA. I think it's a good definition as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people. So getting to that procedural notion, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Environmental justice is set to be achieved when all communities enjoy both the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards, as well as equal access to the decision-making process, to have a healthy environment in which to live, to learn, in which to work. The procedural element you can really see embedded, in the definition. I've also heard environmental justice defined as the fight for clean air, clean water, at a very localized level, very simplified, very localized level. Climate justice, we talk a little bit about, forces us to understand the current climate crisis through the lens of social inequities. It really personalizes it. It has to be people-centered, focused on the individual. It's not just about, saving the ice caps and the polar bears and the viruses. That is important, don't get me wrong. But climate justice forces us to acknowledge the individual impacts. It also forces us to acknowledge, as I mentioned, those deep-seated social equities from which it makes worse, and that legacy of environmental racism that has made this moment possible. And then energy justice, just to throw that in there, is defined as the goal of using our energy systems to achieve equity in both the social and economic participation in the emerging renewable energy system, while also remediating that social, economic, and health burden that has traditionally been forced upon communities on the front lines. The same communities who have historically been detrimented by legacy pollution when we talk about environmental injustice, the same communities who are now, because of those legacies, made to be suffered first and worse when we talk about climate injustice and impacts, the same communities who often suffer from inequity in the energy system, like energy burden. We have to, again, use all three of these concepts to really uplift this notion of the goal really being not just a transition of our economy, but a just transition.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question, which I think is really illuminating. There's definitely a strong relationship between the two things. And some of my work has been about the origins of the climate justice movement, particularly in the global context. And obviously the environmental justice movement is one of the key origins of the global justice movement around climate change. So a lot of the same principles show up in both movements, and it's important for the way we think about climate justice. But I don't think that they're reducible to one another for reasons that William has already said. Obviously, the environmental justice movement covers a broader range of environmental harms than just climate, although one landscape analysis that I read indicates that the vast majority of environmental justice organizations do prioritize climate as their top priority, so big overlap there, but not reducible to one another. But I also think that it's important to realize that the climate justice movement is a little bit broader than the environmental movement too, and it encompasses a diversity of actors in that space. So those who are interested in migration, for example, those who are interested in international development, those who are interested in other issues that involve sort of a systemic critique of the way the international system is run. I don't think that environmental justice doesn't concern global affairs, but there may be a bit of a different emphasis there. Because the environmental justice movement has a history in contesting what may be thought of as more local issues. And obviously, when you're talking about climate change, you have to consider the global sphere. So different connections to other actors that are more global. Finally, of interest perhaps to students, I think it's just the strength of youth in the climate justice movement and the emphasis on intergenerational equity. And how youth have been really strong allies, I think, to those who are advocating for climate justice, and how that's an important component of that movement too.
Oh yeah, go for it.
One quick follow-up as we're defining these terms, especially in the context of environmental justice, it's key that we honor the involvement and the leadership of communities and actually help define this concept, to the forefront of our national and social discourse. When we think about the environmental justice movement, you have to acknowledge the role of, like I said, communities in the Warren County protests that launched a national environmental justice movement. You have to honor the role of citizen science and communities who were being impacted and actually forced the government to play catch up to their realities. I'm referencing the 1987 United Church of Christ Toxic Waste and Race Study that actually was the first time that data was used to track the toxic waste sites across the nation and found that race rather than class was the #1 indicator of which communities were being exposed to toxic waste. And that was being done by communities, the very people who were being impacted and poisoned. It wasn't being done by our government. It was only after that study and after communities gave voice to these realities that the EPA played catch up and began tracking exposure to many of these pollutants. And so just really acknowledging, in many ways, I see it as the self-determination of communities in speaking their reality, speaking their pain, and actually creating windows for all of us to begin engaging in this movement is so crucial. And then I think it is also important to recognize that, you know, the frontline communities have always had to be more responsive to broader realities. The same activists who were leading the civil rights struggle also ended up being the foundation for the folks leading the environmental justice struggles early on, because they had to. It was their communities that were being impacted. And the same folks that are leading the environmental justice struggles are now having to be responsive to the climate justice struggles, because it's their communities that are being impacted. So just honor the community role.
Thank you so much, and you led us into this perfectly, because my next question is actually where you've seen successes and challenges in the climate justice movement now. Where do you see that happening?
Yeah, thank you. So I think there's been a lot of successes of the climate justice movement, and sometimes maybe we don't celebrate them enough. So just thinking about the international process, you know, one of the big demands of the climate justice movement has been recognition and reparations for climate debt, which is the basic idea that, you know, polluters exploit resources and they occupy our atmosphere rent-free, and then there are also impacts for marginalized people for which they're not compensated. And some of my work has traced how the global movement on climate justice has amplified that kind of concept in the international negotiations. I think that can be pretty directly tied to agenda setting around issues like loss and damage, which is the idea of compensating countries for climate impacts that are sort of built into the system, given how our present level of greenhouse gas emissions. You know, so the recognition of that issue and institutional development on that, I think, is a real clear evidence of the impact of the movement. Now, that said, there's limitations there, and I think that this isn't to really criticize anyone, but just to say this is hard work. You know, like it's hard. The agenda setting is easier than the actual implementation and the follow-up, right? And it's been really difficult to actually mobilize attention and funding to really support those who are currently being impacted by climate change. And I think that is unfortunate, and it's not a criticism of the movement, but that's where we need to go, is the actual follow-up and the implementation. So that's something that I think a lot about.
I just add to that one of the difficulties is also implementing accountability. I think that's one of the, I don't think it's a shortcoming of the movement, because everyone is trying, but it's more a shortcoming in terms of output. I'd also say that one of the main shortcomings obviously is the lack of narrative around, or an amplified narrative around migration. Many people approach the climate justice movement from the impacts on the environment, which makes logical sense. But it's just bizarre to me how, to date, even though there are so many physical, outstanding examples of movement, the impact on humans, i.e. movement, is just missing entirely. And I mean, there is some hope, definitely, but I'll just finish off addressing the failings, I think, the main one. You know, when we first started this think tank, one of the first things we did was set our Google alerts to climate migration. And I always reference this anecdote, but just because it's baffling. For the first 8 months, every single alert I got was on monarch butterfly migration. Nothing to do with humans. And yet thousands of people were having to evacuate not only their sort of dwellings, but their countries, cross-border. And this was tracking, you know, all news agencies, local, international, esteemed, not esteemed. And so I think this sort of leads me into the hope I have with the successes. When we first started Earth Refuge, we really wanted to focus on the legal. But so few people knew about migration that we had to work double time and start to define it and draw people's attention to the issue and educate around it. And we couldn't focus on the niche we wanted to focus on. Fast forward 2 years, and so many institutions now have a climate migration hub, movements, classes. So we can now refocus on what the niche we wanted to focus on. So the work is being done, and I see the progress happening. So there's hope. So that's all I have to add. There you go.
I think a number of the recent policy wins are testament, to some real victories. I think the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, even in its imperfect form, was really a testament to the strength of the alliance between traditional environmental and green groups and environmental justice organizations. I think in the moments after really wrestling with what has been known now as the side view and what that meant for communities that were seen as being sacrifice zones, to get national climate action, over the finish line. The fact that we as a movement wrestled with that and really stood in solidarity, and now that deal is off the table when we talk about communities in the Gulf and Alaska not being left behind. I think it's a real testament to the strength of our movement. I think the growing commitments of climate activists, especially this new generation of young climate activists, in prioritizing climate justice and saying we have to ensure that even as we are urgently advocating for greenhouse gas reduction, we cannot do that at the expense of frontline communities. We have to hold transition of our economy and addressing social equity hand in hand. I think that's a real testament to the movement. I think recently, seeing some structural changes, even in the federal infrastructure, the EPA announced the new Office on Environmental Justice and Civil Rights just last weekend. Many of us were there. I think that is a real victory for decades of activism, people who have been in the trenches, grinding, doing tireless work. And finally, I think this growing awareness of solidarity between frontline communities here in the United States and the call for climate justice abroad. It really gives me inspiration when we're recognizing that the same realities that communities here are experiencing domestically often match the realities of communities that are displaced, that are impacted, that are made unsecure, that are having their food systems disrupted, their families disrupted. The fact that we are starting to see those connections and also starting to draw a conclusion as to who some of the bad actors are contributing to that, it really gives me inspiration for the evolution and the trajectory of the movement in the next couple of years.
Well, I actually was going to ask you a quick follow-up since you did bring up the Department of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. How do you see that institutionalization of environmental justice translating or influencing climate justice and how we approach it in this country?
Well, I think, again, if we take environmental justice in many ways as the foundation on which these tenets of climate and energy justice are built, I think the fact that that is institutionalized now in a more robust way will just help strengthen that foundation. Meaning it will help strengthen the activism, the policy activism. Hopefully it would help encourage the activist community, that the voices are being heard, and that there is response, robust response from the government. I put it in the same bucket of the victory of the Justice 40 initiative, which really represents the administration prioritizing environmental justice and understanding and being responsive that we have to drive investments into disadvantaged communities. We have to put them at the center. And when we live from the bottom, it's good for the whole society. I also think that we see this as the beginning. It is not a silver bullet. It's not exhaustive. It doesn't solve the problem. I think it is the beginning. It is the beginning in terms of the scale of resources that needs to be put behind the issue. I think it's the beginning in terms of societal awareness that when we actually look at the scale of the climate crisis, it is of such a scale that no one sector can solve it on its own. Academia cannot solve it on its own. Community advocacy cannot solve it on its own. Private finance cannot solve it on its own. Government cannot solve it on its own. The faith sector cannot solve it on its own. We really have to have a whole societal approach in really addressing this crisis and meeting this moment. And I think, seeing this solidifying of the infrastructure is really beginning to that.
Absolutely. And You all started to touch on this. My next question was, what's your greatest hope for the climate justice movement? I feel like we've started addressing it, and I wonder if maybe we can talk more micro of just an example, a story, something that gives you hope in this, that you've seen that we can connect to in a different way.
Sure, thank you. I'm really glad that you asked this question because I actually have good news. One case that we've been tracking for a long time is that of the Torres Strait Islanders, an Indigenous community in Australia under the jurisdiction of the Australian state. And a few years ago, they put in a case at the UN Committee of Human Rights against the Australian government for failing to protect that community from the impacts of climate change. So the Torres Strait Islanders are located on an island, obviously, and their rituals and existence are so closely tied to the land, meaning burial sites of their ancestors were being wiped away by rising sea levels, and specific animals and creatures that are closely tied to spiritual practices are at risk of extinction. And so this case was brought, and last week they won. And the Australian government owes them reparations and compensation for the trauma that they have experienced, but also the physical evidence of what they have experienced. And it is a huge step because this is a victory not only for that community, but it sets the precedent for communities across the globe, because although experiences are specific to communities, many of the injustices and many of the actors are the same. In principle, and it also highlights and sort of legally enshrines the right to culture, which is honestly a landscape that is lacking. It enshrines the right to experience culture and to pass it on from older generations to younger generations, and intergenerational justice is one of the big dogs when it comes to climate justice, especially in the legal arena, because in order to bring a case, you have to prove to the court that you have standing, so you have a stake in whatever the outcome of the case would be. And it's particularly difficult when we're speaking about future generations because it's hard to tangibly prove that you have a stake in future generations at one point. So this is a baby step, it's a pretty big one, and I think it's something that the climate justice movement should be really proud of, because without the work that's been put in internationally, I don't think this judgment would have been reached.
Thank you.
What a great question. Thinking about this, one thing I'm really excited about is a campaign that was organized in Kenya around the Lamu coal-fired power plant, which is a very large coal-fired power plant proposed for the Lamu region in Kenya, which is a very beautiful and historically significant area. And this would be the first coal-fired power plant in Kenya. It's a very large project, and it had support from China, so it had financial backing that made it likely to go through, and also had support from the Kenyan government. So no reason to think that this would have not been built, except for powerful, organized, persistent community resistance to this, which ended up delaying the project. And I think, although it hasn't been canceled, it's been shelved and will likely not go forward, given China's sort of shift on financing coal abroad. So successful, I think, the final outcome is not undetermined. And there are a couple of things I like about that. I mean, I think it's inspiring to see struggles like this where communities are able to assert their right to self-determination and their right to not have these projects. But also there are really exciting international connections. So I think this is an example of where transnational advocacy networks can work well. The activists in Lamu were supported by the international community, but the international community did not overshadow them. Our NGO advocates let local people take the lead on planning the campaign and supported them where they were asked for resources. And I think that that's a really good model in comparison to how previous NGO transnational campaigns have worked. And I also think it's exciting because what happened in Lamu provides an example for people living elsewhere in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world, and even for people living in the developed world. There's a coalition that has been built out of that campaign called Decolonize, which is meant to put links between neocolonialism and rural development in Africa, and it has spread to multiple countries, I think. the Lemon case provides an inspirational example of what communities can do and make it nice.
Yes, really good question. I'll start by saying there's a quote that Van Jones has in his book, The Green-Collar Economy, where he says the clean energy transition should not just be about reclaiming thrown away things. It should also be about reclaiming thrown away communities, meaning that we have to use this moment of our energy transition to not just give things a second chance, but to give communities that have been historically left behind a second chance in using the transition to our energy renewable economy to create a better existence for all of us. That mirrors one of my personal stories of inspiration, which was the story of a town called Union Hill, Virginia. It was a very small town, historic freedmen community, meaning this was an area where formerly enslaved African Americans settled and really had an opportunity to develop a self-determined area. But in recent years, it was targeted to be the site of one of along the Atlantic Coast pipeline, and actually to house the largest natural gas compressor station on the eastern seaboard. This community that no one expected, you look at it, it was very much a David and Goliath story, was actually able to lead a movement to not only defeat that project, to go on and defeat the pipeline, but to actually reshape and revision what pipeline opposition looked like on the East Coast. And I'm incredibly inspired by their activism. But not only that, many of the same leaders who are at the forefront of that struggle are now leading workforce development programs for the community in terms of solar installations. They are now leading programs to talk about new energy installs, weatherization for the community. They are now tapping into some of these opportunities we've seen in recent legislation about really lifting this community up as a model of what it means to transition and bring it fully forward into the clean economy. So honoring that and showing that that doesn't have to be a unicorn case, that we can do that in many communities nationwide and across the globe is one of my hopes. I also hope very dearly that we continue to honor the history of the community contribution to the foundational tenet of environmental justice as we explore these concepts and as they continue to evolve. And I also hope that we continue to really recognize this as a moment where we have to hold in tandem addressing social equity while building the clean economy, which has major benefits for all of us. I mean, we're talking about something on the scale of $50 to $131 trillion when we talk about our energy transition on a global scale. And we have to think about how do we move that type of capital in a way that not only looks at communities as new markets, but as moments to invest in these communities, undergird them with resiliency, and reclaim some of that self-determination that has been lost.
Thank you to all of you for those inspiring stories. I mean, it's incredible to hear so many different stories while also the roots staying the same, that it's communities who came together even before that moment actually happened, and then the moment did happen. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I mean, as you heard, we're currently celebrating two major milestones here. We have the 40th anniversary celebration of the Warren County protests, as well as the Duke climate commitment. So in the nexus here, how do you recommend that Duke students, faculty, staff, alumni, our community more broadly ensure that climate and environmental justice remains a central part of their work?
I would say, in addition to everything that's been said today, really recognize that reclaiming the importance and urgency of climate justice as we think about the path forward, climate justice, energy justice, and environmental justice, is really not new. It's actually a return to basics. In the 1970s, when the concept of sustainable development was actually being formed, there were three pillars that were articulated: ecology, economy, and equity. And over the course of time, ecology and economy has gotten quite a bit of attention. But that equity component, especially from the community lens, has often fallen by the wayside. We now have a moment where there's a critical mass of voices, of consciousness that can really redress that mistake, redress that blind spot, and actually force us to think about sustainable development in the way it was originally intended, and in doing so, actually create net benefit for communities at a time where it's most urgently needed. Because, be rest assured, we urgently need all hands on deck when we talk about this moment that we have to be.
That's right, and I think it just makes it incredibly clear that we need interdisciplinary collaborations and also community collaborations, right? So that academics are engaging with a broader set of stakeholders than we typically do. And I actually want to say that from where I sit, I think this is something that Duke does well, and this is something that building on existing strengths, right, is to build out those programs more, and to also center justice in those discussions, right, and to keep up that commitment. So, just keep up the focus in these areas as these things are getting built out. And part of that may be thinking about rethinking academic incentive structures for researchers to make sure that researchers are rewarded for doing that kind of interdisciplinary and community engaged work. So I think that's really important. And also that undergraduate training, graduate training doesn't end up being as siloed into disciplines as sometimes it can be, because we need tools from multiple areas of academic study to have any chance of tackling this problem.
Thank you. I would just add to those recommendations, tap into the programs at Duke. I think the students and faculty are immensely privileged to even have a platform to contribute to. But I would also caution that environmental justice and climate justice, in fact, vary from other disciplines because they are active and live issues. Many of you might be from communities that are affected. And so I would caution not to become too entrenched in the academics and the theories, and to actually ensure that there are elements of practical action intertwined in that motivation. And I'd also say that in the same light, to center community experiences and also community recommendations, whether you're from an affected community or not, they know what they're talking about. They are from those areas, and they are so intrinsically linked to the land that they know what recommendations should be enforced, whether or not they are state or policy recognized. So I think that there needs to be a level of respect that's maintained, which I doubt anyone would vary from, but that's my 2 cents.
Thank you all Thank you all so much. And we are going to end at 1 today to honor Duke's decision to end classes in person at that time. But we have a few minutes left if anyone in the audience here has a question. I see one, so go ahead and I'll repeat it for everyone online.
Excuse me?
Once you say it, I'm just going to repeat it so that everyone online can hear us too.
Okay, it's a very long question.
Okay, maybe I should give you the mic. Here you go.
I'm really excited to be here because this is a problem I've been working on, trying to figure out how to put climate justice and environmental justice together. So I work at the intersection of bringing community into meta-community. All these people, climate education and climate change encompasses so many different things. There's practitioners in each category, but they don't really yet have the language and have the understanding that they're all working towards the same thing. So that's where I work. And I advise 2 organizations, and one is on a nationwide scale, and one is on a Southeast scale. And one of the things I do is match artists and organizations together so that like the artists could give a shout out from the stage and such, and try to activate the audience to do a certain thing. So this is my question. Climate change is a global problem with global consequences, right? When people think they're doing climate action, they always tend to think of global. But I find this idea, the global, it's hard to get people to carry through a commitment with that because they're not really seeing the evidence. Whereas if they do something local and they're with a local organization, they can go down to the beach and say, hey, the beach is nicer today than it was 5 years ago, right? And, oh, that's my telephone, sorry. And so how to put that together, how to show that environmental justice is also climate action, but how to bring the nation back to its locality. So it's quite a complicated question. Do you need any clarification on it?
You will. If not, I can just pass the mic back to them. Thank you so much. Who wants to start? Go ahead.
I think it's a great question, and I think many of us in this space find ourselves at kind of that nexus or that intersection of bridging worlds. I think, what I've found very effective is the just transition framework in showing that that is a common lexicon that these worlds can understand, because if you understand it as environmental justice, climate justice, and energy justice, those concepts really creating a Venn diagram of activism and action. I found it being, really compelling in getting financiers and technologists, for example, to understand the urgency of what communities are facing on the ground. The other piece of that is, I think, in any type of engagement or seeking to engage with communities, there are two curves that we have to climb. I call them the knowledge curve and the trust curve. The knowledge curve being a reality that while communities absolutely understand, know what they are experiencing, oftentimes communities on the front lines have not had the privilege to think about what this means in a global context. It is hard to think about and to even be concerned about in many cases the anonymous global climate impact when you're fighting the coal-fired power plant right in your backyard. It's hard to think about, increased hurricanes, and what they mean in the aggregate when you're just trying to feed your child at night, or when you're, encumbered by high energy burden and are trying to just keep lights on. But that nexus again of climate, of just transition actually helps us break through that knowledge curve, because it forces us to articulate the global in the individual and local context. Energy burden is a climate issue. Food security is a climate issue. Housing is a climate issue. And when we do that, we change the lexicon, so we're not saying, hey, you all should be so worried about, the hurricane. But at least let's say, hey, we need you to know that this climate crisis that we're talking about is going to make it harder for you to keep lights on. It's going to make it harder for you to feed that child. That the coal-fired power plant that's in your backyard is not only poisoning your community locally, but it's disrupting similar communities on a global scale. Shifting the narrative that way I found really effective. The second curve, of course, is the trust curve. And that's more of a relational building, meaning that often at an individual scale, people have to get used to you just showing up. You have to show up, you have to be a trusted voice. You have to develop relationships. I say, relationships move at the speed of trust, especially when we're talking about engaging communities that have traditionally been exposed to predatory practices by academia, by industry, sometimes even by the green community that has often helicoptered in activism, extracted what was needed, and then moved on. And so those two curves, are really important, I think, to keep in mind as we bridge those.
Well, actually, that wrapped us up. We're right at 1 p.m. So thank you all for coming today. Thanks our panelists for us today. And thank you all for joining us online and staying safe from the storm. Thank you.